And no nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space.
May 5th, 1961. Alan Shepard splashes down. A triumph, yes, but one that tasted like ash. After Gagarin's historic orbit, 15 minutes of suborbital flight felt like a consolation prize. The Americans had finally put a man in space, but the world was still looking toward Moscow. For the young administration in the White House, it wasn't just a technological gap anymore. It was an existential crisis. If the US couldn't lead the future, they would soon be irrelevant in the present. John F. Kennedy understood the currency of the Cold War wasn't just missiles. It was narrative. He needed a victory so singular, so astronomically impossible, that it would reset the global scoreboard. On May 25th, he stood before Congress and did the unthinkable. He didn't just propose a mission, he issued a dare to history.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
In a single afternoon, the finish line of the space race moved nearly 400,000 kilometers farther away. The floodgates opened. Federal funding poured into NASA, transforming a small civilian agency into a colossal engine of innovation. For Wernher von Braun, it was the vindication of a lifetime. He finally had the mandate to build the impossible, but he had stepped into a new kind of cage. He was no longer just an engineer. He was a national asset under the microscope. Every decision was scrutinized, every delay questioned, every dollar justified. He was reaching for the stars, but for the first time, he was never truly alone. February 1962. John Glenn finally proves America can do what only the Soviets had done before, 3 times around the Earth. It was more than a flight. It was the validation of the Mercury program and the proof that American grit could match Soviet audacity. The race wasn't just on, it was accelerating into a new, terrifying velocity. Von Braun had his resources, Korolev had his crown, and the finish line was no longer the sky. It was the surface of the moon. The countdown to the impossible had begun. By 1960, the how remained unanswered. NASA's elite were locked in a war of engineering philosophies. First, there was direct ascent. It was the blunt force trauma approach. Build a rocket so gargantuan that it could lift a complete landing craft, the return fuel, and the crew straight from Florida to the moon's surface in one monolithic, terrifying blast. It was simple, it was bold, and it was economically and technologically impractical. Then there was von Braun's preference, Earth Orbit Rendezvous. Von Braun argued that we didn't need one impossible rocket, we needed 2 manageable ones. Launch a propulsion stage, launch the manned craft, dock them in Earth orbit, and then make the burn for the moon. It was the engineering equivalent of building a bridge before you cross the river. It felt safe, it felt logical, but to many inside NASA, it felt like a recipe for a docking disaster that would leave men stranded in the black void of low Earth orbit. Enter the outsider, John Houbolt. While the titans of aerospace debated the size of their boosters, Houbolt was doing the math on the tyranny of the rocket equation. He realized the mission was being strangled by the weight of the fuel needed to land, and then take off again. He proposed a radical, dangerous idea: Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. Stop trying to land the whole ship. Send a small bug down to the surface, and leave the heavy fuel and the massive command module in lunar orbit. It was lean, it was efficient, it was considered heresy. In the rigid hierarchy of NASA, Houbolt was a nuisance. He bypassed his superiors, firing off a series of defiant letters that bordered on insubordination. He was mocked, ostracized, and ignored. Even von Braun, the man who worshipped the elegance of design, initially remained unconvinced, believing Earth Orbit Rendezvous offered the safer path. To the architect, the idea of a lunar excursion module felt like abandoning his crew to a graveyard of lunar dust. But math is the only language that doesn't care about politics. By mid-1962, the dead end of the big rocket and the logistical nightmares of Earth Orbit Rendezvous became undeniable. When the data finally collided with reality, the room fell silent. Von Braun, the master of the massive, looked at the small, elegant solution Houbolt had spent years defending. The architect understood. He had been fighting the mission, but Houbolt had found the path. In July 1962, NASA made its decision. Lunar Orbit Rendezvous would become the blueprint for Apollo. The quiet engineer who had risked his career by challenging his superiors had won. The big rocket dream died, and the lunar module was born. The mission had a plan, von Braun had his blueprint, and the road to the moon was finally terrifyingly open. While the Americans obsessed over the physics of the moon, Korolev played the game of perception. Khrushchev demanded spectacle, and the chief designer delivered. In 1963, he launched Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space. She orbited the Earth 48 times and spent almost 3 days in orbit. It wasn't just another first. It was a propaganda triumph that left NASA stumbling. The Soviets looked egalitarian, progressive, and effortless. They were winning the battle for the world's imagination, one orbit at a time. By 1964, the hunt for spectacle turned desperate. With Voskhod 1, Korolev pulled off the impossible. 3 men inside a capsule originally designed for one. To make it fit, he stripped away the cosmonauts' spacesuits. One minor leak, one failure of the life support system, and the entire crew would be dead. It was a high-risk, high-wire act. To the outside world, it looked like humanity had taken another giant leap toward the age of space stations. It made America's methodical Gemini program appear painfully slow by comparison. Then came the first spacewalk, March 18, 1965. Alexei Leonov stepping into the void was a vision of the future until it nearly became a tragedy. In the vacuum of space, Leonov's suit inflated, turning him into a rigid, pressurized balloon. He couldn't fit back through the airlock. With his oxygen running low, he made the unthinkable decision: bleed pressure from his own suit, risking decompression just to squeeze back inside. He survived, but the terrifying brush with death remained hidden behind the Iron Curtain. To audiences around the world, the scoreboard looked brutally one-sided. Every few months, another Soviet headline reminded the world who appeared to own the future. America wasn't simply racing the Soviet Union anymore. It was racing the growing perception that it had already lost. The pressure was becoming unbearable. Khrushchev saw space as a chessboard. Korolev saw it as a minefield. Every spectacular victory raised expectations for an even greater one. Every success demanded a bigger gamble. The chief designer found himself trapped between engineering reality and political ambition, forced to choose between the safety of his cosmonauts and the demands of the Kremlin. He knew luck was running out. One catastrophic failure wouldn't just destroy a mission. It could destroy everything he had spent his life building. The Soviet Union appeared unstoppable, but beneath the flawless headlines, cracks were beginning to spread through the foundation. The victories were becoming more dangerous, the pressure more relentless. And for Sergei Korolev, the man carrying the entire Soviet space program on his shoulders, the cost of staying ahead was about to become impossible to bear. Publicly, the Soviet Union was a juggernaut of destiny. Privately, it was a house of cards held together by grit and state-mandated silence. While the world marveled at every first projected by the Kremlin, the engineers behind the curtain saw a different reality. The Luna probes, meant to chart humanity's path to the moon, were repeatedly crashing into the lunar surface, becoming expensive wreckage. The Soviets projected invincibility, but the math was whispering failure. The cracks ran deep. In 1961, a young cosmonaut named Valentin Bondarenko died during a high-pressure, pure oxygen training exercise. It was a hellish inferno, a devastating reminder that fire in a pure oxygen environment was a death sentence. But there was no national mourning. There was no public inquiry. The Soviet state simply erased him from existence. His photographs were removed, his records sealed, and the lesson buried behind the Iron Curtain. While America would eventually confront its failures in public, the Soviet Union buried theirs in silence. Every problem fed the next. Secrecy concealed failures. Concealed failures slowed learning. Slower learning demanded greater risks. Greater risks required even greater secrecy. The Soviet program had entered a dangerous cycle, one where protecting the image of success became almost as important as achieving success itself. As the cost of maintaining the illusion of supremacy grew, something else began to suffer: the resources needed to turn Soviet ambition into reality. The diversion of resources wasn't simply bureaucracy, it was strategy shaped by fear. Soviet military leaders remained convinced that nuclear deterrence would decide the Cold War. Heavy missile programs consistently received the political backing and resources that the lunar effort struggled to secure. The N-1, the Soviet Union's only realistic path to landing cosmonauts on the moon, was forced to compete for funding, talent, and political attention. Every delay widened the gap with Apollo. The mission was further crippled by a venomous feud between Sergei Korolev and Valentin Glushko. It was a technical deadlock that mirrored their clashing personalities. Korolev wanted powerful liquid oxygen and kerosene engines capable of lifting a lunar rocket. Glushko refused. He believed hypergolic propellants, fuels that ignited on contact and could be stored for long periods, offered the only practical future for large rockets. To Glushko, Korolev's approach was dangerously impractical. To Korolev, Glushko's engines would never deliver the performance needed to reach the moon. They could not agree, and the Soviet lunar program paid the price. Then came another blow. In October 1964, Nikita Khrushchev, the political patron who had championed spectacular space triumphs, was removed from power. His successor, Leonid Brezhnev, never embraced the lunar race with the same urgency. Suddenly, Korolev found himself fighting not only engineering problems, but an increasingly indifferent bureaucracy. The public still saw an unstoppable space program. Behind closed doors, its momentum was fading. The paradox of the Soviet program was now complete. The more firsts it achieved, the further it drifted from the finish line. It possessed the appearance of unstoppable momentum, yet underneath, secrecy, political rivalry, divided priorities, and technical deadlock were slowly pulling it apart. The world still saw an empire racing toward the moon. Inside the Soviet program, the race had already begun to unravel. In January 1966, the heart of the Soviet space program stopped beating. Sergei Korolev died on the operating table. With him, the Soviet Union lost the only leader capable of uniting its rival design bureaus behind a single lunar mission. To the world, he was a ghost. To the Kremlin, he was a strategic asset. But inside the Soviet space program, he was the indispensable architect who kept competing ambitions moving toward the same destination. A vacuum of leadership invites the vultures. Vasily Mishin, Korolev's loyal deputy, inherited an impossible throne. He was a gifted engineer, but the Soviet system no longer needed only an engineer. It needed a statesman, negotiator, and political heavyweight. With Korolev gone, the fragile alliances he had built began to fracture. Valentin Glushko, no longer restrained by Korolev's authority, pursued his own vision for Soviet rocketry. Cooperation gave way to rivalry. Technical disagreements became political battles. Without Korolev, engineering decisions became political compromises, and political compromises became engineering failures. Nowhere was that more evident than in the N-1 moon rocket, the Soviet Union's only realistic path to landing cosmonauts on the lunar surface. It was an engineering masterpiece on paper, relying on 30 first-stage engines firing in perfect harmony. But extraordinary complexity demanded extraordinary leadership. Instead, the program lurched forward with divided authority, competing design bureaus, limited testing, and mounting political pressure. The result was a succession of catastrophic uncrewed launch failures that transformed years of engineering into towering fireballs. By April 1967, the mounting pressure finally claimed a human life in flight. To celebrate the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution, the Kremlin demanded another triumph. Despite serious concerns within the program about the Soyuz spacecraft's readiness, the mission went ahead. Vladimir Komarov climbed aboard, knowing he may not return, choosing to risk his life so that his friend and national icon, Yuri Gagarin, would not have to. Vladimir Komarov never returned. A parachute failure sent Soyuz 1 crashing into the Earth, making him the first person to die during a space mission. His death became more than an engineering failure. It became the heartbreaking symbol of a system where political deadlines had begun to outweigh engineering caution. Yet, even in decline, the Soviet program still demonstrated flashes of extraordinary brilliance. In September 1968, Zond 5 became the first spacecraft to carry living creatures around the moon and safely back to Earth. It was an astonishing achievement that proved Soviet engineers remained among the finest in the world. But only months later, Apollo 8 carried humans into lunar orbit. The Soviets had proved they could still send spacecraft around the moon, but they were running out of time to be the first to land people on its surface. The paradox was complete. The Soviet Union had pioneered the space age, launched the first satellite, sent the first human into orbit, the first woman into space, and completed the first spacewalk. Yet the system that produced those historic triumphs had slowly undermined itself. When Korolev died, it did not destroy the Soviet lunar program overnight. It simply removed the last man capable of holding its many fractures together. The race for the moon had entered its final chapter. For the first time since Sputnik, history had begun to favor America. As the Soviets accelerated into their desperate speed era, NASA took a quieter, more tectonic turn. Project Mercury was the conservative foundation, but Project Gemini was the secret victory. While the Soviets chased headlines, NASA was busy mastering the machine. By the end of 1966, NASA had mastered rendezvous, docking, orbital maneuvering, and extended spaceflight, the essential skills for reaching the moon. From James Webb's headquarters to von Braun's Marshall Space Flight Center, a new philosophy took hold. If a system couldn't be trusted on the ground, it had no place in space. It was a culture of systems engineering, the realization that spaceflight wasn't just about reaching the finish line, but about the ability to survive the journey. Gemini 8 was the masterstroke. Armstrong and Scott achieved the first ever docking, a technical ballet in the vacuum. After docking, a stuck thruster nearly sent the spacecraft into an uncontrollable spin. Armstrong's calm response saved the mission and demonstrated the kind of disciplined decision-making Apollo would demand. By the end of 1966, NASA had learned the operational language of the stars. They knew how to fly to the moon. They were simply waiting for the rocket to carry them there. But in their rush to meet Kennedy's deadline, they had built a machine of unprecedented complexity. A private sector army of thousands of contractors. And in that vast industrial sprawl, the mission began to outpace the safety margins. Even the most rigorous culture can be blinded by its own momentum. On January 27, 1967, NASA collided with its own hubris. During a plugs-out test, an electrical spark ignited the cabin. In a 100% oxygen environment, the fire didn't just burn, it exploded. The internal pressure jammed the inward opening hatch shut. In seconds, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were gone. The tragedy was identical to the oxygen explosion that killed Valentin Bondarenko in the Soviet Union. Here, the paths of the two nations diverged forever. Unlike the Soviets, who buried their tragedy in the archives, NASA tore its own house down. They exposed the lethal design flaws, and the inquiry was ruthless. They found a fourfold executioner, an electrical ignition source, a cabin atmosphere of pure, high-pressure oxygen that transformed mundane materials into explosive fuel, a payload of nylon netting and Velcro that turned the interior into a tinderbox, and a plug-type inward-opening hatch that required the internal pressure of the fire itself to keep it sealed shut, making escape a physical impossibility. They didn't erase their dead. They turned their names into the blueprint for a better ship. Failure became data. Apollo would reach the moon not because NASA avoided failure, but because it refused to waste it. The Apollo 1 fire was a horrific tragedy, but for NASA, it became a brutal, defining reset. It forced the agency to stop chasing speed and start obsessing over discipline. They fundamentally redesigned the spacecraft. They engineered a new, quick-opening hatch that could be operated in seconds. They replaced the volatile, pure oxygen ground atmosphere with a stable nitrogen mix, and they swapped combustible cabin materials for self-extinguishing, fire-retardant alternatives. This wasn't just a redesign, it was an institutional evolution. NASA embraced rigorous configuration control, a painstaking system where every bolt, every wire, and every modification had to be documented, verified, and re-verified. The agency had become a machine that demanded perfection. That discipline gave NASA the confidence to take one calculated gamble. George Mueller championed an audacious strategy known as all-up testing, launching the entire Saturn V rocket at once rather than testing each stage separately. Many engineers thought it was reckless. Yet, because every component had already been subjected to relentless verification, the gamble paid off, saving years of development without sacrificing reliability.
T-minus 1 minute, 35 seconds on the Apollo mission, the flight to land of the first men on the moon.
By the time the crew of Apollo 11 climbed aboard, they weren't sitting inside a prototype. They were climbing into one of the most thoroughly tested machines ever built. July 16, 1969. After 8 years of relentless engineering, the machine was finally ready. Rising 110 meters into the Florida sky, the Saturn V remains the tallest, heaviest, and most powerful rocket ever to successfully carry humans into space.
10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
At liftoff, 5 F-1 engines unleashed nearly 8 million pounds of thrust, more power than had ever been harnessed by mankind. Every second, the rocket consumed almost 13 tons of propellant, sending 3 astronauts on a 4-day journey to another world. It was Wernher von Braun's masterpiece, the physical embodiment of 10 years of relentless engineering, thousands of brilliant minds, and over 6 million individual parts working in perfect harmony. July 20th, 1969. The final test. The lunar module. Eagle descended toward the Sea of Tranquility, low on fuel and under the gaze of a waiting world. Armstrong manually guided the spacecraft beyond a dangerous boulder field, searching for safe ground as the fuel reserves dwindled. It was a masterpiece of piloting, balanced on the knife edge of engineering. When the engine finally fell silent, both the machine and its crew had done exactly what they were built to do. Then came the moment Kennedy had imagined 8 years earlier. Neil Armstrong stepped into the gray, eternal dust of the moon. As he spoke those iconic words, the world stood still.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
It was the absolute triumph of a decade defined by blood, sweat, relentless testing, and systems engineering. The impossible had been made routine. In Washington, the victory was complete, yet it remained shadowed by a haunting contingency. President Richard Nixon had a speech waiting in his desk, a eulogy prepared in case Armstrong and Aldrin became stranded on the lunar surface, forever beyond humanity's reach. But the speech was never delivered. The space race had never simply been a contest between rockets. It was a contest between engineering cultures, political systems, and the willingness to confront failure. One nation chased spectacular firsts while the other quietly built a system capable of learning. In the end, the moon was reached by extraordinary people, but it was won by an extraordinary system. In the 1960s, America was a nation pulling itself apart. The wounds of the Vietnam War, the assassinations of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., and deep racial divisions threatened to unravel the country's social fabric. But for one remarkable night, the noise stopped. Across the divides of race, class, and politics, millions looked toward a single television screen. The moon landing wasn't simply a flight. It became a rare moment of national unity, a reminder that even a deeply divided democracy could still accomplish the extraordinary. The impact reached far beyond America. The U.S. State Department wielded the moon landing as perhaps the greatest propaganda victory of the Cold War, a gleaming demonstration of American technological, industrial, and organizational capability. Yet the achievement was deliberately presented not as a conquest for one nation, but as a giant leap for mankind. 3 astronauts became global icons, and for millions watching around the world, Apollo became the defining symbol of what societies could achieve when science, industry, and political will aligned. Behind the Iron Curtain, the reaction was one of studied silence. Soviet television did not broadcast the landing live, refusing to let their citizens witness the American flag planted in the lunar dust. When the Kremlin finally acknowledged the achievement, it quickly shifted attention back to its own robotic missions and scientific accomplishments. Privately, however, Soviet engineers understood exactly what Apollo represented. The Soviet Union may have lost the race to the moon, but it quietly laid the foundations for humanity's future in orbit. Through the Salyut program, the world's first true space stations, it mastered the demanding art of long-duration spaceflight, orbital life support, and modular habitation. Korolev never lived to see that future, but the engineering philosophy he had championed endured long after the lunar race had been lost. From Salyut to Mir, and ultimately to the International Space Station, his influence continued to shape humanity's permanent presence in space. For the architect, the ending was quieter. Wernher von Braun watched political enthusiasm for exploration fade as budgets shrank and attention returned to the problems of Earth. He died in 1977 at just 65 years old, carrying with him an unfinished dream of reaching Mars. He remained a titan of engineering, forever shadowed by his controversial past, and remembered for helping transform an impossible vision into reality. The Cold War race ended with a handshake in orbit, but the fire it ignited never went out. The great contest between nations had reached its conclusion. The next chapter would belong to a different kind of pioneer, entrepreneurs driven not by ideology, but by markets, ambition, and the dream of making space accessible once again. The race to the moon was over, but the race to the stars was only just beginning.